Thank you, thank you. And it's so nice to be here. I've been, as Babak said, back in the Cornell days, I was dealing with like these complex systems, and I spent my time studying how humans understand complexity, really thinking about it as a cognitive challenge. And then I went into industry, and all that time at Nuance and Google, I was actually building expert augmentation systems. So what I did is build tools to help humans figure out complex systems like healthcare or finance and things like that. And what I realized is that humans have actually been dealing with complex systems for a long time. Really, it's not a cognitive challenge. It's actually just part of the system. And it's part of the most interesting systems, right? And so whether it is financial markets or distributed computing centers or even agents themselves, complexity and trying to figure out what is happening with these complex systems is beyond any one human's understanding. There's no one human that knows the financial markets, and yet we use them every day, right? Just being complex does not make it unsafe. Being unsafe is a design choice. And looking at these other areas where humans have built and designed complex systems that we can all use every day, bridges, for example, nuclear facilities. We can actually look at how these systems have developed safeguards and apply those safeguards to how we build AI. So today, it's kind of like a recursive talk where we're going to be talking about AI systems for finance, and we're going to be using the same safeguards that finance uses to determine whether the financial markets are safe. We're going to apply some of those same principles to the AI systems, these agentic AIs that are being used, and we're going to show how we can actually start thinking about things and making them more reliable, more robust, and less likely to fail. All right. So this is just a quick cover of what we do. Babak was just talking about digital twins. We actually work quite a bit with building digital twins, and a lot of companies have digital twins across a variety of their areas, whether it's operations, whether it's the supply chain. A lot of companies have these digital twins, and really in the end, for these agentic systems, what we do is we take these failures, we convert them into synthetic twins, because we work in regulated industries where actually you can't take the failure data and use it, right? In healthcare, we can't actually take the clinical trial data that failed and give it to all of the developers in the open source community to figure it out. There are privacy constraints. We wish we could, but we cannot. And so instead, what we do is we create this synthetic data that takes the signature of these failures. We use them to create repair packets that are then tested on agents, again, in another simulation environment. And then we verify these improvements through things like mean time to repair. This is a very boring loop. There is nothing new to this loop. I think what's interesting here is that we finally have a system where we can kind of apply the system to itself to make this loop run a lot faster. For example, in financial markets or in clinical trials, by the time we detect a failure all the way to the time that we repair it, sometimes those cycles are like 15, 20 years. Now we're talking about really reducing those cycles, which means that we have a complex system now that we can start to study in and of itself. Okay, so what I typically do on a day-to-day basis is I go into these AI companies, not AI companies, I go into like Finance 500 companies, like the companies that are going to be building out AIs to help them do their work. And they go in and they're like, we are developing lots of AI. They are all developing lots of AI. And I'm like, great. Are you testing it? Oh, yes, we are definitely testing this AI. And they always show me something like this, which is some kind of a dashboard. It has accuracy of some kind that they can't really explain. Usually it's accuracy that comes from, the model providers themselves, right? And the really critical thing at this point is that this is not going to tell us how to build a system that is more reliable, right? This is not going to help us build a more safe system because it's not clear to us that accuracy is even the thing that will allow us to have a more reliable system. Usually we need a lot more information. We don't just detect these failures. We have to detect the right failures And then we have to know how to improve them. So in the end, even though this is a great place to start, and I see a lot of things around AI evaluations right now, I want to make it very clear, this is our starting point. And frankly, a lot of times the starting point is not sufficient. So we spend a lot of time just getting to this point. And this matters because, and I think that this is something somewhat interesting. I don't know how many of you know this, but all of these companies really are developing AI and agentic systems, even in the most regulated industries, right? Your doctors are using LLMs. They might not be telling you that they are, but they are, right? When you look across these companies, some interesting statistics is that all of these companies are also building LLMs for their workers to use, because then they want to operationalize their workers' knowledge and then fire them, right? And so then a lot of these workers know that, and so they don't use the company LLMs. They're just buying their own chat GPTs, and they are using them on the side. But I'm just telling you, like, a lot of these companies know that first of all, they know that their people are using LLMs. They know that they have to get these tools out there, and they know that they're going to lose if they don't. And so right now, like, there's lots of these statistics, but from McKinsey's ops blog, across the Fortune 500, 82% have things in development around agentic AI. And just really quick, I mean, I'm curious here. Do people know the difference between like LLMs and agents? Are we kind of okay on that? Yeah, okay, good. Are you guys using LLMs? Are you allowed to say? Yeah.
So Marisa, since you're quoting McKinsey just also recently reported that there's only 15% return in their investors.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Okay. Yeah, I know. Thank you for the lead. Exactly. Like they're all doing this development, but look at that funnel go down. This is actually not that surprising. So a lot of McKinsey cites that, and like the hand wringers love those statistics, right? Because they're like, see, you're not going to fire us, right? But in the end, these numbers are actually very typical for these companies, because a lot of them have innovation budgets. Their innovation budgets are usually 90% failure, right? So this is actually not bad. I know that looks bad to us, but I think that what's interesting here is this very clear drop off, right? And here, so of the 82% in dev, only 10% are actually going out to users to be tested, meaning they don't even know if they're useful. They're just barely useful and acceptable, right? And then once we get down to getting fully deployed, meaning they found some smidgen of use, generally speaking, it's not even that. What's happening is somebody from the top down, usually the board, is like, you got to get this out or else, they're going to eat our lunch, right? But even once you get there, fully deployed, there's very little that are actually getting iterated upon and improved. And that is death, right? For most software. Like most technologies that we get out are absolutely terrible at first, and then we iterate upon them and we make them better, right? The problem is we don't know how. And arguably the reason why this is coming through is because of the unknown cost of failures. We have no idea how these things are failing. We have some ideas, right? Based on like consumer use of the products, but we don't really know how these things are going to fail. And we probably won't know how they fail until they get out. So we need more of these things out in order to know how they fail, in order to improve them. And then when we think about the complex systems years, like we're talking about 15 years to improve them, I don't think that's going to work. Like that's definitely not the expectation in the Fortune 500. So really critical that we start thinking right now about how to improve these systems. They are going to fail. We don't know how, we don't know what the cost of failure is, but we at least know about other systems we've built that have been like this, and what have we done in those places to make it better. And specifically here, when I say other systems, I'm talking about complex systems. Complex systems, exist everywhere. The immune system is a complex system. Swarms of birds could technically be a complex system. But for technology companies, or any company, any information technology company, which arguably any company is, this is very different. This is not deploying software. This is not even like deploying models. Like a lot of these companies are pretty sophisticated now, not just tech companies, but in finance, they've been deploying models for a long time. these are complex systems in their own right. Most companies thought of complexity as coming from humans, right? So that's why cybersecurity, the main focus of cybersecurity is not about how the technology reacts, but about all the weird ways that humans react with technology or use it in improper ways, and they try to figure that out. Well, now we have two sides of complexity coming in, right? They're dynamic, they're adaptive, they're interconnected. Like there is no model. There are usually like, the systems I'm working with are hundreds of agents built in like 6 months, right? So who knows how much those are going to progress, right? Failures are not only complex, but we have no idea what the consequences are. We have, we can guess at the consequences, but we don't know the impact of those consequences, which of them are really going to cause serious problems, especially reputational damage, and which ones won't. And frankly, we also just don't know how users are going to use them. There is no product market fit even for ChatGPT, which is why they're trying all of these different products, right? So very similar to other things we've built, like the financial markets, like distributed data centers and things like that. Like no human really understands how they work. But there is somewhat of a new perspective here because these agents, and if they are built correctly, the agentic systems actually do have the potential to self-heal. So this is where we start talking about how long does it take to detect and how long does it take to repair these systems. We've had systems that we've used where those numbers are very long indeed, but we've been able to build them. Now we're talking about systems that can do this much faster. And I think that really gives us the potential to use them in interesting ways to help us better understand the world. Okay, so it's the same loop. This is the typical repair loop for any complex system. And the main difference that I'd like to talk you through is the fact that now we can use agents and LLMs to lubricate this entire thing so that we can actually get to this faster. We know the metrics we want to go for. We know the process that we have to do. Now it's just a matter of using agents in specific ways to test the agents we're using, to test the humans or the complex systems that are being used. Okay. All right. So what I just talked about was essentially complex systems and how we are all using complex systems all the time. Complex systems aren't inherently unsafe. That is a design decision, and it's on us to put into place the safeguards. And one of the first safeguards that we want to put in place is making these systems more reliable. Reliability for us means reduced failure rates. We want to detect those failures, repair them quickly. That will make a more reliable system, and that will hopefully get that really steep funnel into something that looks a little bit more manageable so that we can iterate on it. Okay. So I know that you guys do a lot of work in data centers and healthcare. I don't know if any of the healthcare people are here. The complex systems and a lot of my clients are actually in finance, not just anywhere in finance. We're not just like creating, quantitative models to ruin the housing market or something. I actually work with auditors. Auditors are interesting people. Does anybody know any financial auditors? No one. I know, because you don't think they're interesting, right?
I actually know.
See, I know people don't really think about this, but here's something interesting. So what, you know a person too?
One person.
Just one. And you don't bring them to dinner parties.
Well, this is the startup connection.
So, what auditors do is they help enhance trust, or they establish trust in the financial market. Essentially, any publicly traded company, which means if you're going to put your money into the stock market, their books have to be audited by one of the big 4 accounting firms. Okay. And the way that they do this is they basically go in and they are able to sign off. They look through the books of the company and they're like, this company is not lying. You can believe these numbers. And then whether the numbers are good or bad does not matter. It's just that you can trust those numbers. And now you have a reason to give your money to them. The stock market goes down, the financial market becomes more and more complex, and nobody understands it. But supposedly, like, it eventually works out. And they are foundational to this, right? Now, financial markets, right, they're constantly evolving, they're dynamic, very highly interconnected. So even though the US has its own rules with the stock market, like the various other indices have their own rules, failures are highly complex. It takes us time to detect them. The housing market correction was one, right? It might take us quite a bit of time to figure out what happened. But despite all of this, we have these humans who are highly educated professionals who go about ensuring safety and trust without fully understanding how the market is working, right? And despite the fact that they have enormous know-how, we're talking about, like, most of these companies have been around for 200 or 300 years. They have enormous know-how in what to do here. Errors and fraud are just endemic to the system. 25% of audits have serious deficiencies. And if you think about that number, like compared to healthcare or anything else, that is significant. And yet we all still trust the financial markets, right? So even though these are the best possible humans, the best possible processes we have to understand this very complex system, we are not very good at it. And in the end, these companies know this. The regulators know this. And so if we can build technology to help them do this better, they would love it. They are huge investors in technology and outsourcing and all sorts of things to do, right? They've been doing this for a long time. And, you know, when you look at the kind of work they do, it makes complete sense because it is very boring. It is so boring to do this work. So this is a typical audit workflow. I'm putting this here as well because this kind of gives you an idea of like what would really be required when people are like, we need AI safety. I think people don't really understand like what would be required and how few people probably really want to do it. But essentially what happens in financial audits is they go about, they do their research, and they determine the risk. Where in the books there is likely to be risk, maybe because they're using technology, maybe because a new executive came in, whatever that might be. They have a lot of know-how to determine the risk. Based on the risk, they use pretty sophisticated sampling techniques to go into the books and figure out where they should be looking. And then once they find those areas of the books, they re-perform it, meaning they redo the work calculated by hand. They use huge numbers of people who really hate doing this work and do a poor job of it, really, because it's just, you know, documentation review, and it's not great. Humans are not good at that stuff. But once they've done, they know, by the way, that humans are not good at it. So they also have worked into their process multiple levels of review. But once they've done all of that testing, they determine whether the company is compliant or not, or their systems are compliant, and then they publish and certify their results. A lot of people argue, by the way, that this is what needs to happen with AI systems too, right? There is an independent board that reviews these things. They're the ones who said that most audits, or 25% of audits, have serious deficiencies. So they are determined. Like there are performance metrics on here, but again, they take so long. Usually it takes about 2 years before those things happen. This whole process, I wish that we've been working on robotic process automation for this for a long, long time, but it's bespoke, it's collaborative, and a lot of times it actually determines the competitive advantage of these companies that do this kind of work. And so they don't really want to like totally operationalize it, but this is the work that they do. And arguably this is the kind of work that would need to be done to fully audit an agentic system as well. But we're not going to be talking about fully auditing agentic systems here. Instead, we're going to be talking about monitoring the systems that these companies are building to do their work. Okay? So let's take those examples, right? Like of the things that auditors do. They know approximately what they do. They calculate things, they compare things. A lot of times there's whole loops of these things that go back and forth in order for them to do these tests, right? And they're building agentic systems to do this, like the most boring parts of their work. They would really like to standardize and use technology. The problem is oftentimes those things are so bespoke by the time they build a technology, there are too many edge cases, they don't actually work. So agents are really important here. Agents should be robust enough to all of the edge cases to be able to start to make sense of it. And that is what we're seeing. These agentic systems are doing pretty well at doing some of this work. And just so we're all on the same page in terms of what I mean by an agentic system, I take a cognitive systems approach to what agents are, right? So for me, an agent is going to be something where the behavior, the knowledge, and the interaction patterns are described in some formal way, right? These are different types of memory, we could consider them, but essentially, whether it's all in one big giant prompt, which is becoming less and less of a thing, or whether you have very specific tools and things that the system is using, or different knowledge bases that it is using, in the end, an agent is going to have behavior, knowledge, and interaction patterns. That for me is an agent. Most of the systems are not one agent. I mean, you can think of ChatGPT maybe as one agent, right? It would kind of fall into this. But actually, most of these systems are many of these agents that are have very prescribed tasks that they do. And then on top of it, you have to add to the complexity, there are underlying tools, underlying knowledge stores, users, all of these other dynamic elements that come into it. So in the end, when we are monitoring a system, we're not just monitoring an agent, we're usually monitoring the entire complex system. That usually means that we are also monitoring the users of that system and how they are doing it. We are looking at full outputs. And that means that now we have the potential to actually start measuring why audits are failing so much, right? Because we are starting to get to the point of being able to develop that kind of work. Okay, so I went into financial markets and auditing a little bit too much there, I think, but I'm going back to the tech. What we just talked about is how financial markets as a complex system, despite being a complex system, is something that humans have figured out how to work around and build safeguards around. Overall, the financial markets are relatively safe, right? And so we're going to start to use some of those same ideas to the agents that are being built to help us better understand these financial markets. Okay, this is the part where I actually, go into how we are doing this. And I'm not going to go into like every little bit of this. What I want to make clear, and I think what would be useful for those of you who are like, really thinking about what are the metrics to actually build out or determine how these complex systems are working, like, whether it's distributed systems or even just the work that you're doing. I want to talk about how we're using AI to lubricate this process to make it a lot faster. Okay, so the very first thing is that with agentic systems, we have a lot of telemetry that before we were not able to see, right? When it came to nuclear systems, it took many years to determine what the telemetry, what the metrics were, or what the signals were, in order for us to figure out like what to even do and what to measure and what to evaluate. Luckily, with agents, like the traces, the interactions, the outputs, all of these things usually come for free in most of the agentic frameworks that we have. And so that means that we can actually spend our time building out many more evaluators. And unlike in the past, when we had to have a bunch of human labeling or really figure out that data of like what kind of things are we going to evaluate, by the time you even start to build out your evaluation set, the model has drifted, you're out, right? We actually don't have to worry about that so much because we're using LLMs to help with some of our rule-based and statistical evaluators. And we basically triangulate across all of these to be able to build out monitors for quality, suitability, and efficiency. Those are our three main things that we monitor in these systems. Quality, you can think of it as just basic accuracy, but it's also things like completeness. Suitability is whether it's being useful to the user, right? A lot of times you can have something and if the user's not using it, or if it's just tedious, or they have to review the work, they're not going to use it. So that's really another critical aspect to look for failures. And then efficiency is going to be not just the cost efficiency, not just the time efficiency, but the whole system efficiency. Once we get to that final deliverable, not just the person who's using this agentic system, but that final reviewer, have we actually seen that the reviewer is leading to a higher quality product and not having to send things back over and over again. So this is essentially how we go about looking at what we're monitoring, right? And this is critical to just baseline what we need to do. The other important thing here, right? And I know in academia, we love like single thresholds, right? We love to have accuracy and benchmarks. But the other thing here is we want as much information as possible at this point, because it helps us at this next step. And this is the part I think that a lot of people stop at that monitoring part. But actually, just because we hit a failure does not tell us if it's an important failure, if this is something we need to focus on, if this is something that anybody really cares about. So the next step of the process that's really critical is triaging. Generally, a very human process. Not just human, but the top experts are usually required to do this. This is very, very expensive usually, right? So we find a failure with our monitors. We determine based on quality and suitability, there's been some failure. Well, using LLMs, we can triage them, right? But the really interesting thing here is working with the businesses, we build out these risk cubes. And I think that this is one of those things that, you know, a lot of like the organizations that have a lot of sophistication with risk, like auditors, are very conscious of this kind of calculation. But I think a lot of times we in computer science only think about a few of these axes. So the really critical thing for them is, you know, based on the monitoring, we can figure out the probability of an error. We find a failure, we can figure out the probability that the failure is occurring, and that gives us some information, right? And that might be the end of it, right? Like, okay, we are at 2% accuracy whenever like this happens. That's obviously a failure. But is it a failure we need to care about? Is it the most pressing failure in order to make the system as useful as possible? Well, usually in order to figure that out, we have to think about the consequence of that failure, right? Is it the kind of failure that is going to make us have a terrible audit opinion? Determine like we miss an audit finding and there's fraud? Well, that would have a pretty high consequence. So, but again, if it's pretty low probability, we're still in this green circle, right? Now, here's the other side of this. It's actually another third axis here. And that's the exposure. Does that happen like once every 4 years? Right? So even if something is happening like once every 4 years and it's very high probability, it might not really be something that you need to focus on. But is it like a TikTok algorithm that is being, or a TikTok video that's being used by like 12 million people, right? Now your exposure has increased significantly. So even though you have a fairly tiny error, this is actually something that is very high risk. So what we try to do is we don't just look for failures. We try to triage those failures by their impact. And in order to do that, we have to get these systems out and we have to have the business owners to really understand where their risks are, okay? And that helps us prioritize and determine where we want to repair. It's only by doing that we can actually get to reliable systems, because otherwise we're just going to be inundated by a whole bunch of failure cases that we're going to have to repair. And you know what? When we get down to it, most of the repairs are going to counteract each other, right? So a lot of times in these systems, you repair one thing and your other metric goes down. Which one is more important? You have to answer that question first. And so a lot of times in regulated industries, like that's why I like working with them, like in healthcare, fairly easy, don't kill anyone, right? Like that's a great place to be. Finance or audit, our reputation's in danger. We cannot miss a finding, right? Or at least if we miss a finding, we have to have followed the process to demonstrate that we followed the process and the process is wrong, but it's not our fault. That's usually the way that they go about things. Okay, so we talked about monitoring, first phase. The next step is triage, right? We actually have to figure out what to prioritize. And then we do simulations to create a bunch of synthetic data that allows us to take this failure case and make it into something that can either be used for retraining or for changing the procedural memory or for doing something like that. So I want to walk through this example really fast. All along, supposedly, we've been using this financial example where, and this is a real case in audit, we have these agentic systems. And one of the things that auditors go over a lot is expense vouching. expenses in a company, like, are they codified appropriately? If they're not, there's cases for fraud, right? So this is actually a big part of the work they do. Super boring work, right? But this is a lot of what they do. And in this case that we actually have from one of our agentic systems, what happened was our agentic system, which was looking for fraud, hallucinated a finding. But the interesting thing is that they didn't just hallucinate a finding, they hallucinated an underlying document, right? So the agents didn't just hallucinate the data, they hallucinated a document that should have been there that would have told them that there was an error here, right? And our system, our monitoring system, was able to catch this, luckily, because we audit whether the data exists in underlying forms, right? So what happened was the audit system knew that there had been reports for 2020, 21, 22, 23. They did not see one for 2025. The agentic system hallucinated that this report existed and then did a bunch of audit work based on it. The humans didn't catch it, right? For the humans, like, that 2025 case should have been there, right? So they were not going to catch that the system hallucinated here. We did. And but we couldn't actually, like, use any of the data from the clients, because as you can see here, it's like a lot of real receipts. And these are companies that are not going to share their data, right? So instead, what we did is we generate essentially what is the failure that happened. From that failure, we create synthetic data that maps that failure. And what I have here is a bunch of, like, synthetic, actually LLM generated receipts. Do you guys know about this? Oh man, this has taken the financial world by storm. This is all generated by LLMs. So if you work for a company, like today, I went and got coffee, right? In order for your company to pay you back for that coffee, you have to submit this receipt. And it's a pain. It's so painful, and you always forget the receipt. And so what they found was actually a lot of people have been using LLMs to generate these receipts. They look pretty real, right? This is a nightmare for these companies. Absolute nightmare. They hate this use case. But the advantage is that we can actually, because of LLMs, they're very, very good at this. And actually what we do is we generate a bunch of these that show us the statistical coverage of the error. In other words, it's not just that one time that one guy that you know is always going to, you knew he was going to commit fraud from the beginning. It's not just that one guy that you have to go look for. You can actually take that error case, you can create a bunch of different samples, and now you have a real error that you can then provide to your developers, let's say, and say, here's your data, here's the error, go fix it. This is not something that has been easy to do in healthcare or in finance or in a lot of these regulated industries, which is why it's been so hard for us to make advances in them, right? A lot of it has to do with this process.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about these LLMs? Are these LLMs, do they know anything about the data? Are they tuned?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do a few things, yeah. So we usually don't do any fine tuning, but we do use LLMs. What we do is we use a bunch of different LLMs to create a simulation, right? And then the simulation we create is a simulated company. So we actually go, like, all in. We use these LLMs, like, they're so creative, like, go all in. We simulate an entire company. We simulate the CEO, like, all of the different people who might be there, right? We create these highly complex simulations. And then from there, we're actually able to create much more realistic synthetic data that maps to the types of complexity that you usually see. And that is in finance, like, it makes a ton of sense, right? Like, you have these receipts that don't match these, like, 30,000 line ledgers, right? But when you think about it from the healthcare perspective, and you think about, like, the complexity and the realism required for a real patient file, that is not something we've been very good at simulating in the past. But these LLMs are very good at it. And actually, we don't do really any tuning. We're using straight LLMs. We use a variety of them. And then it's really about, again, from the agentic perspective, it's both the interactions that we're using and also the procedures in order for them to generate these things. And just in terms of, like, the numbers here, right? Like, in order to cleanse some of these documents for these companies, like, we're looking at, like, $2,000 for them to just like use software because the software is not reliable. So then they have all these human checks. We're able to do this in like, like $100, right? So we really reduce the cost. Yeah.
Sorry, if I understand correctly here, do you provide a synthetic generated data to the company so that they can check their system, or you actually train a classifier?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So I don't care what they do with it, right? Because I don't tell them how to repair it, right? Sometimes we can, right? But if we're talking about providing this to the developers, that's where I stop, right? I basically say, here's your error, here's your test, and here's your data, right? Now you go figure out what you have to do. Is it your procedural, most of them have these super complex prompts and they're not really thinking about their prompting strategy. So it's somewhere in the prompt. But technically they should be building these more sophisticatedly, and then we would be able to see that. But the difference here is with agentic systems, we can actually give them the adaptation and they can apply it themselves. Okay, so we can have the hypothesis that you made up version 2024 of this policy, version 2025 of this policy document. It does not exist. Okay, go in, find version 2025 if it's there, and now only use that, right? So once we have that adaptation, right? Like once we're able to say, and I should say some of this does rely on some humans in the loop, but the humans are no longer all over that loop, right? It's just in very specific places. Maybe they're just reviewing these adaptations, right? And then on top of it, we can automatically create the tests that would tell us, because of the simulations, whether the adaptation worked. And we have the data, it's synthetic, for them to apply the patch. So whether it's the agents who are applying these patches, now this is a very simple example where they're just, changing the underlying content. That's the easiest possible fix, right? Or whether it's the agents who have, they're self-planning agents and we've changed the procedure in some way. We now have a test and we have the data, and this is actually a repair packet that can be applied and the agents can apply it themselves. And when we can verify, which is the next step, that it happened. Okay, so that's the last step. Like we verify it. And these numbers make no sense, right, to us, right? These are like numbers that the auditors think are really important and things like that. But once we know what's important, we verify that it happened, and we can then push these changes out, and we have a new loop to improve on. And importantly now, we should see our mean time to repair go down and our failure frequency go down, right? Until it doesn't, actually. And then what's going to happen is all of our low-hanging fruit go away, and then our mean time to repair starts to go up again because we hit really, really hard problems. But that's a good problem to have. The other side of this is by doing it this way, we are actually putting the humans where they need to go. Right now, in most regulated industries, humans are having to oversee a lot of LLM output. They're terrible at this. They miss everything, right? This is not what we want to have happen. This slide is key. These are the metrics that we need to know. And this last step is actually, it should have been the first step. It's rarely the first step for a lot of these companies. Most of us don't know the kind of work we're doing. Most companies don't actually want to know. Like they don't want to know these numbers because it starts to look really bad on their bottom line and someone's going to get the axe, right? So it's actually very interesting to us because a lot of the numbers we need to improve these systems are not available. So what I'm going to talk about next is how we help companies get to that. Yeah.
From what I understood, you're trying to feed some generated data to those who are developing agents in order for them to work on whatever they do. But in industries like, for example, healthcare, that they're trying to convince us that the data is private. How can we rely on whatever that the LLMs generate
Is it
to actually be correct, that to be used in fine-tuning what?
I love it. This is our demo, right? Exactly the right question. Simulations. These companies have known about simulations for a long time. they've been doing like war games. Somebody at lunch was talking about war games, right? War games have been happening for a long time. And like, I was talking to one of the chip manufacturers and they have like whole supply chain war games. And I was, and then like, in the end, the simulation is only as good as it reflects reality, right? And in order for it to really reflect reality, we need our experts to be able to be there to actually ground it. But the experts don't want to work with simulations. It's very hard for them to do that. They know what they know, but translating what they know into a useful simulation that we can then use to build synthetic data, that has been way too hard in the past. The trick is that with LLMs, I think that we can actually use those LLMs to create the requirements to ground these simulations better. And that is how we're building out the synthetic data, but then we validate it. We validate it in a few ways, against real humans and against agents again. So we're using agents all over the place. Let's look. Okay. So this is a demo of what we're doing to create the types of test conditions for these types of LLMs. And this is one of our finance demos. And here's something that everybody wants, like compliance summaries, right? Like this is such a boring thing, right? But essentially a lot of the work that people in these companies do is determine whether a contract is compliant with the policy or not. It's terrible work again, right? And most of those contracts and compliance, it's highly skilled people who might know a lot about healthcare, who might know a lot about legal challenges, who have to review these things and really understand what the problems are. Now, these highly skilled individuals, it doesn't matter like what contract they're reviewing, they know what they're looking for. And so what we do is we use, this is our docent agent to try to extract from them what they know, like what are the errors, what are the edge cases, what are the real requirements for this simulation, so that we can actually build a simulation that's grounded, okay? But the other interesting thing is because LLMs are so interactive, we can actually use the LLM to continue to make that simulation better. So we're gonna collect the requirements, and again, humans are terrible at writing requirements, but we work with the LLM to try to fill in those requirements as best we can, okay? And so that's what we end up getting is essentially a simulation configuration, right? Out of talking to them, we actually push them into very specific like regions of surprisal, more surprising things to help them better think through their use cases, okay? And importantly, we also understand when they're like, no, you've gone too far, that doesn't happen, right? So we use that to create the simulation configuration. And then if we do go into like generating these test cases, we have the humans like go in and we're like, okay, we created a bunch of vendor compliance documents for you, okay? And here is one error. Does this look good? We continue to work with them until we've actually gotten to the point of really understanding. And this is where these actually originally the synthetic data was really just a medium for us to better understand if we got the right configuration for the simulation. It turns out that the data is also very useful for them, but really it's through the data that the humans can really understand, okay, was my test case actually useful? Like, does this really make sense, right? All right. So they go through and they look at these and they're like, yeah, this looks good. This looks good. That looks pretty good. Well, then again, like, how do we know if the simulation is even working? Like, what if this data is not right? We use another set of LLMs to simulate, right? And to be the agent. So we're going to sit there and we're going to take, just basic ChatGPT. We're going to take, an LLM that is tuned to risk, another LLM that is tuned towards specific healthcare things. And we want to triangulate across all these. Like, we want these to kind of work off of each other. We can generate, like in one of my clients, we're generating thousands of agents off of a single prescription of an agent. And then we look at the distribution of responses, right? So in the end, right, we could always be wrong, right? But the point is that by using all of these processes together, we have less chance of being completely wrong. And in an area where there has been zero data to date, this is still better than what we had before, okay? So this is just one way that we've gone about this. And I think that the other really critical thing here is I showed at the end that we want to verify, we want to have the right metrics. This is also our way of testing the metrics because no human knows what the metrics are. I can't go to an auditor and be like, what are your quality standards? They're going to say their quality standards are 100%. Always. What are your efficiency standards? 100%. We're 110% actually, right? Like that is what they're going to think. But this actually gives them a way to really think through what would be the way to verify that these systems are working and we get to real tests, right? So again, we're testing agentic systems, but we're also using agentic systems to help the humans better understand and test those agentic systems. Okay, so it's like agentic complex system to help us understand a complex system, to help us understand a complex system. And then the output from this, honestly, like we have the various results, and then we use this data, like I said, from in the way that they've been using so far. And so far, just to give you guys an idea of the numbers, right? So if I wanted to get failures from the agentic systems and give them to my developers, which they want to do, right? Or even if before the developers even touch something, the developers have to create a calculation agent. All right, can you give us some data? There's like no data. So what they give them is like these fake files that auditors have created because they can't actually use client data. It's one file. 10 at best. This is how these things are being developed, right? Well, now we can give them like 1,000 documents, and we can also provide them with the statistical coverage of those errors that they know exist so they can actually see that this is happening. And underlying it all is a sophisticated simulation, which hopefully in the next year or two, they will just start using as their client simulation, right? To see how things go and like, and actually see whether build simulations for some of these very specific things. Yeah. No, this is great.
Has there been an attempt to make a feedback loop from the developers to the data synthesizing efforts in order to make this better?
Yeah, I love it. Yes, exactly. So that's where we want to go, right? In the end, we want this to be as automatic as possible. Wait, just to make sure I understand your question, you're saying like the developers who are building these agents like the first time, right? They want the test data. Is that what you're saying? Or
they're done with fine tuning or iterating or making their whatever agent that is? Are they trying to help your team to generate better data for them or people like them?
Yeah.
Because we know that things have to be ambiguous for the sake of privacy, but maybe they can like what happens in federated learning, they tell you some things that you need to know without exposing anyone.
Exactly. So the hope is that, so there's a few things, right? A lot of times the developers don't know the edge cases. It's not until they're using the system that we actually know what those edge cases are. So that's one critical thing. A lot of times what we're doing is informing the developers of these edge cases, right? At the same time, when it comes to using this data, let's say for retraining or something like that, right? We do know enough, like we generate the statistical coverage that comes from the auditor's understanding of the risk profiles, right? So it's kind of like if we give it to them, then like the model should replicate that, which is already something that we don't know is true. So our hope is that by putting these systems in production, we're using as much real data as possible to inform those numbers, to inform all of those things. And then that actually leads to better and better models and better agents. That's the hope, right? Because in a lot of these cases, nobody really knows what the reality is going to be. These are complex systems themselves, and nobody knows what the pharmaceutical issue is going to be. Yeah.
I have a very different question. So these LLMs, when they're trained, like they generate these synthetic data based on what they've been trained on, right? So how, like my question is, how good are they at creating novel scenarios or like new bug scenarios?
Yeah, I think that they're not actually, but the humans are good. And the interaction of the humans and the bots are usually pretty good together. I think like, it's just like the reason you guys are using LLMs, right? Like if you're stuck, like You can't go to an auditor and be like, what are your requirements for your agentic system? They don't know, but you can start to talk to them about like what they see, right? And then the agent is like, oh, cool. You mean like this? And then the auditor is like, no, not at all like that, but they iterate. And that the speed of iteration there is so different from the speed of iteration between a product team and a dev team and a problem team, right? Like that's just a totally different. And now you have an expert's worldview. Like, let's say it's like a doctor, right? And like, this is what I see, and this is how often I see it. I never see that. Oh, but you know what? Yeah, you brought up this. Like, I actually do see that. What else do you think is in this space? Okay, 3 of those are great. 2 of those are terrible. You iterate until you get to the point of seeing it. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that question. So, the demo that you showed, you were setting up, for example, the simulation environment through interaction. I actually have a question before I ask my main question.
Yeah.
First one is, do you fine tune for the customers that you have, like the LLMs? Is that something that you do?
Yeah, so far we haven't had to. They're really good at doing this. Like I showed you like those receipts.
Yeah.
That was like straight, that was I think 3.5, right? Like, that was a while ago. That was GPT 3.5. In general, we have not had to do that yet, but the hope is that we generate enough of this data and we find the good ones, like because of the risk and the impact and the triage, to be able to actually start to fine tune these models to the use case, right?
And so the follow-up is, the reason I asked is because, so there was a paper from Google DeepMind and Meta this January that were trying to make a data set for testing, it wasn't even agents, it was just ranks.
Yeah.
So much simpler. In that case, they were seeing 30% hallucination in the data set that we're creating, so they kind of completely gave up on creating the data sets for the LLMs. And I would guess, I mean, the demo that you showed, you were just doing the setup with interaction, but you could technically do the same thing for creating the inputs to your simulator.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that cause a problem when you're doing the simulation? Because now you're not fine tuning on that data. So you're essentially passing that to the agent every time, which means the huge context that's being added to the agents every time. Isn't that a huge trade-off?
So, yeah. So what you're saying is like, essentially the simulation then becomes the new context for the agent. Or the simulation is just a playground, a testing ground for you to determine whether your agent.
Sorry, actually, let me clarify what I meant. So for example, in your scenario, you have a bunch of agents in your simulation, and you're also using agents to create data for your simulation, right? And if they make mistakes, you could potentially have your users interact with them, say, this is not a good synthetic data, this is how you need to improve it, right? But then you need to reiterate on that, and all the improvements that they ask for is something that you have to constantly reuse over and over again.
Yeah. So, I mean, to an extent, right? Like, I think if we are trying to create like full data sets at all times that are going to, fully determine like the entire use case, I'd say that's the problem. But the problem that I'm working with is it's on the other side, right? So I very specifically and strategically stay away from the development side, right? Okay. On the improvement side, our use case is much smaller. We have a failure. We know it's a failure. We have a bunch of data about like why it's a failure. We know that it's what its risk profile is, right? So now what we're creating is actually a very specific set of data that is consistent with that failure case, right? Well, eventually, you want this to actually feed into your full simulation and make a much better simulation, right? But I think that you're right. Right now, that's not technically feasible. We don't even know yet if that's going to work, right? I think that there's still a lot of work just to show that this process is going to work.
And one last question I have is that you can use this to see like what your problem is or something. Are you using this to, for example, like if you're trying to study another agent that someone else is making their system as well, right? Are you also focused on like simulating, for example, stress testing, seeing how well can you? Is that part of what you're doing as well?
Yeah, so that's the eventual hope, right? Is that this actually becomes like your stress testing environment, right? Like that kind of a thing. On the development side, right? Like before you get out. In other words, like the goal is to be able to predict these failures before we get out so that we reduce the impact, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm more interested on actual, not like errors, but actual, like, for example, the throughput of the system that you have when you have all these agents. We want to study that. And then studying that from experience, because I did make an agent system before in a company, studying is not that easy because you can potentially just mock the LLM calls, but that's not going to give you the full picture. But if you want to do a stress testing with the LLM, it's going to have a huge cost. And as you're changing, for example, there's a paper from Kaiser University, just changing the strategy of how your agents look at prompts and the data that they retrieve will have an impact on your performance because the number of steps change. So how do you do a stress testing on all?
Well, so first of all, I think that those are really important questions, right? And I think that that's where a lot of people get stuck. I make a few simplifying assumptions. One, I'm architecture agnostic. I'm not just architecture agnostic, I'm agent agnostic. I'm machine agnostic.
I see.
Right? So this is the complex system I'm talking about is actually a human machine system. Multiple humans, multiple agents. The output I'm getting, like the system throughput, is actually these deliverables that have been happening for a long time.
I see.
Right? So that I think is one critical difference. You're right. When I look at like, especially at the development level, like the evaluations that are required, and all of those, like these requirements that don't even come from anything. I mean, it was very frustrating for us, like building these agentic systems before all of those problems that you're saying. I decided to go on the other side because in the end, even those supposed problems, like what is your stress testing requirement? Nobody has a good answer, right? But we get these systems out, we see how people are using them. Now we start to see failures. Now we start to have a better understanding of what that stress testing requirement might be based on real data, right? But the other thing is that we have that simplifying assumption. But you're absolutely right. Like I did see that paper. I don't love all of the techniques they use. Like I think that like in the end, like these types of exercises have not done well overall. Even data annotation tasks and all of these things have been problematic for a long time. They took the simplest possible approach. I think that the really interesting thing here is putting the humans in the right side of the loop, right? Right sizing the loop for the humans who are the experts, and only then can we actually get to some really interesting things. This is not going to be some big consumer throughput operation. Yeah, no problem. I know that we're at time. This was my last slide. I have some open question slides, which we actually went through. But I would love to collaborate. I'm going to flash this up if anybody has any questions, and then I'm going to go back to some of the open questions, which you guys started to talk about already, right? Like drift. Now we have multiple systems drifting, right? Like we've got to think about that. Benchmarks, always a problem, right? And I stay away from them, but that's the world that we live in, right? I noticed this before, but like self-healing conflicts, right? Some of these failure cases have improvements that conflict with each other. How do we determine what the best one is? Old problems, new way of thinking about it, and we don't have to just like live in an unsafe world just because it's complex, right? We can do things about it.